She had herself branded. A hot iron pressed against her own skin, deliberately, to leave a permanent scar. She had her hair cut off. She starved herself. She tied her own wrists. And then she walked out to a highway and called it a kidnapping. While she was doing all of this, her husband was on national television, sobbing, begging America to help find his wife, their 2 children at home, and she was 3 hours away at her ex-boyfriend's apartment, voluntarily. True crime, dark stories, and the kind of cases that keep you up at night. All things I'm mildly obsessed with. And based on the fact that you're still here, so are you. And if you're new here, we drop a new case every other day. Real stories, real investigations, no fluff. Hit subscribe so you never miss one. Takes 2 seconds. Okay, let's get into this. To understand what Sherri Papini did and why she did it, you have to first understand who she presented herself to be. Because the version of Sherri Papini that the world met in November of 2016 was not a complicated person. She was not a woman in visible crisis. She was not someone who appeared to be unraveling. She was, by every external measure, the picture of perfection. Sherri Papini was born in 1984 and grew up in the Redding, California area, a mid-sized city in the northern part of the state, known for its hot summers, its mountains, and its deeply conservative, tight-knit communities. She was blonde, slim, and conventionally beautiful in a way that photographed well. She cared enormously about her appearance, her fitness, her hair, her skin. Friends and acquaintances described her as someone who put tremendous energy into how she was perceived. The image she projected was everything. She had married Keith Papini, a quiet, hardworking man who was deeply in love with his wife. Keith was not flashy. He was not complicated. He worked a steady job, came home to his family, and by all accounts was a devoted husband who believed completely in the life he and Sherri had built together. They had 2 young children, a daughter and a son, and they lived in a house in Shasta County that, from the outside, looked like everything a young family was supposed to want. And Sherri leaned into that image with everything she had. She maintained a presence online, a carefully curated portrait of domestic bliss. The fitness routines, the home-cooked meals, the beautiful, healthy children, the devoted husband. She was what people on the internet had started calling a super mom, someone who seemed to manage everything effortlessly, who made perfection look not just achievable, but natural. People admired her, people followed her, people looked at her life and felt that particular brand of envy that only comes from believing someone else has figured something out that you haven't. But behind the curated photos and the wellness content and the image of the perfect wife, there were cracks. People who knew Sherri well, not just as a persona but as a person, described someone who was deeply unhappy, someone who felt trapped, someone whose sense of self was so tied up in how she was perceived by others that the gap between who she actually was and who she was presenting herself to be had become impossible to sustain. She had been in contact with an ex-boyfriend, James Reyes, through Facebook, a man she had dated more than a decade earlier, someone from a different version of her life. A time before the perfect house and the supermom blog and the 2 children and the husband who believed in her completely. November 2nd, 2016, a Wednesday. Sherri Papini left her home in Shasta County to go for a jog, something she did regularly. Her routine was known. Her route was familiar. She dropped the kids at school that morning and went out. She didn't come back. When her children weren't picked up from school, the school called Keith. He came home. And on the road near where Sherri jogged, he found her earbuds and her phone. Just sitting there on the ground, no Sherri, no sign of struggle, no explanation, just her things left on the side of the road like she had simply stopped existing. Keith called the police, and then, and this is where the story left the quiet world of Shasta County and exploded into something national, he went on social media. He posted about his missing wife. He shared photos. He described what she had been wearing. He was desperate, terrified, and utterly without answers. And the internet responded the way the internet responds when a young, blonde, conventionally attractive woman goes missing. Immediately, overwhelmingly, and with the kind of collective urgency that drowns out almost everything else. Within hours, Sherri Papini's disappearance was everywhere. Facebook shares, Twitter trending topics, national news segments. An Amber Alert was issued. The FBI was brought in alongside local law enforcement. Search teams combed the area where her phone and earbuds had been found. Helicopters, search dogs, volunteers. The full weight of a modern missing persons investigation and a fully engaged, deeply emotional national audience descended on a stretch of road in Northern California. And Keith Papini was at the center of all of it. He appeared on television. He gave interviews. He stood in front of cameras with tears streaming down his face and told America about his wife, about his children asking where their mother was, about coming home to a house that felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He was every husband in that moment, every terrified father. America looked at Keith Papini and felt his pain as a real, authentic thing. Because it was. His pain was completely real. He had no idea where his wife was. As the days passed and no trace of Sherri was found, investigators began to build a case around the only lead they had. Before her disappearance, a neighbor had reported seeing a dark SUV driving slowly near the area where Sherri jogged. And when Sherri was eventually found, she gave investigators a description of her captors. Two women, Hispanic, in a dark SUV, who had pulled up beside her, grabbed her, and thrown her into the vehicle. The description went public. Composite sketches were drawn up based on Sherri's account and distributed nationwide. And what followed, in communities across Northern California and beyond, was a wave of fear and suspicion directed at Hispanic women that was, in the words of civil rights advocates and community leaders at the time, deeply disturbing. People reported their neighbors. People avoided strangers. The sketches circulated on social media with commentary that made it clear exactly who people were looking at with suspicion. All of it based on a description that was completely fabricated. 22 days after she disappeared, on the morning of Thanksgiving, November 24th, 2016, a motorist on Interstate 5 near Yolo County, approximately 150 miles from Sherri's home, spotted a woman on the side of the highway. She had a bag or cloth tied loosely over her head. Her wrists were bound. She was thin, visibly thin, in a way that alarmed the person who stopped. She flagged them down and identified herself as Sherri Papini. She was rushed to hospital. The images released publicly showed a woman who appeared devastated, gaunt, bruised, her long blonde hair cut short and ragged, and on her right shoulder, a brand. A mark burned deliberately into her skin, still healing. A symbol she said her captors had placed there as a mark of ownership. America wept. Keith Papini wept. The story of the supermom who had survived 22 days of hell and made it home to her family, on Thanksgiving morning of all days, became one of the most emotionally resonant news cycles of that entire year. People called it a miracle. And that's where the whole story cracks open. Because nothing about Sherri Papini's story held together under scrutiny. Not then, and increasingly, not as investigators began to quietly pull at the threads. The FBI agents who interviewed her in the days following her return were experienced. They were trained in precisely the kind of detailed, methodical questioning that reveals inconsistencies in a story. The gaps, the contradictions, the details that don't quite fit. Sherri's account was vivid in some places and frustratingly vague in others. She described her captors in physical terms, but couldn't reliably describe the places she had been held. She described the abuse with emotional intensity, but the forensic evidence didn't consistently match the timeline she was presenting. Investigators noted that some of her injuries were harder to account for than others. The branding was real, the weight loss was real, the hair, cut. But the way the injuries had healed, the patterns of bruising, the physical evidence in totality, it didn't perfectly match 22 days of violent captivity by two unknown women. The investigation continued. Publicly, it looked like a cold case. No suspects were ever arrested. The composite sketches of the two Hispanic women went nowhere. The FBI never closed the file, and behind the scenes, they were still working it, still processing evidence, still waiting for a piece of the puzzle that would make everything else make sense. That piece came in 2020, 4 years after Sherri Papini was found on the side of Interstate 5. Investigators had collected DNA from Sherri's body and clothing when she was brought into hospital in November 2016. That DNA, foreign DNA, not Sherri's, had been processed and run through databases. And in 2020, it came back with a match. The DNA belonged to a man named James Reyes, a man who lived in Costa Mesa, California, in Orange County, more than 600 miles from where Sherri had supposedly been held captive. A man who, if you dug into Sherri Papini's past, you would find had dated her more than 15 years earlier. I need to stop here, because I genuinely want to know what you're thinking right now. Because she had a brand burned into her skin, she starved herself, she cut her own hair, she constructed an entire fictional kidnapping complete with composite sketches of two women who didn't exist, and nearly pulled it off for 4 years? Drop your reaction in the comments right now, because the next part of this story is something I still can't fully process, and I've been through this case multiple times. FBI agents traveled to Costa Mesa and knocked on James Reyes's door. He was in his mid-30s, living a quiet life, largely off the radar. He was not a criminal. He did not have a record. He was, by every visible measure, an ordinary person who had once dated a woman who was now the center of one of the most publicized missing persons cases in recent American history. When agents explained why they were there, that his DNA had been found on the body of Sherri Papini, he initially denied knowing anything. But investigators had done their homework. They had phone records. They had Facebook messages. They had the DNA. And eventually, James Reyes told them the truth. Sherri had reached out to him through Facebook in 2016. She had told him she was unhappy, that she felt trapped in her marriage, in her life, in the version of herself she had built and could no longer sustain. She wanted to get away. She asked if she could come and stay with him, just for a while, just to breathe. And James Reyes, who had history with her, who still cared about her, who believed he was helping someone in genuine distress, said yes. On November 2nd, 2016, the same day her earbuds and phone were found on the side of a road in Shasta County, Sherri Papini drove to Costa Mesa. She moved into James Reyes's apartment. She spent 22 days there, while her husband sobbed on national television, while her children asked where their mother was, while hundreds of law enforcement officers spent thousands of hours searching for a woman who was not missing. The injuries were not inflicted by two mysterious captors. The weight loss, she had controlled her food intake deliberately during the 22 days. The hair, cut by Reyes at her instruction. The bruising, some of it self-inflicted, some from situations she had engineered to support her story. And the brand, the mark burned into her shoulder that America had seen as evidence of something monstrous done to her by her captors. She had asked James Reyes to do that to her. She told him it was needed, that without physical evidence of the kidnapping, no one would believe her story held up. He pressed a heated implement against the skin of her shoulder, and she let him, because she needed the scar. On November 24th, Thanksgiving morning, James Reyes drove Sherri to Interstate 5. She got out of the car. She bound her own wrists loosely enough to flag someone down. She put something over her head, and she waited by the side of the highway for someone to find her. Then she came home and told the world about the two women in the dark SUV. When investigators presented Keith Papini with what they had found, what the DNA evidence and the Facebook messages and James Reyes's full account revealed, his entire world collapsed. This was not a man who had suspected his wife. This was not a troubled marriage in the visible, dramatic sense. Keith had believed in Sherri. He had gone on television for her. He had held his children and told them their mother was going to come home. He had built the entire 4 years since her return around a story that was a lie from the first word to the last. He filed for divorce. On March 3rd, 2022, more than 5 years after the faked kidnapping, Sherri Papini was arrested at her home in California. She was charged with 2 federal counts, making false statements to a federal law enforcement officer and mail fraud. The mail fraud charge related specifically to the $30,000 in victim compensation funds she had collected from California's Victim Compensation Board, money intended for actual victims of violent crime. Money she had applied for and received based on a kidnapping that never happened. She also owed restitution for the cost of the investigation itself, the FBI man-hours, the search resources, the law enforcement time that had been ripped away from real cases, real victims, real missing persons who needed that attention and didn't get it because an entire apparatus was focused on finding a woman who wasn't lost. The total restitution figure ordered by the court, approximately $300,000. In April 2022, Sherri Papini pleaded guilty to both charges. In her statement to the court, she said she had been struggling, that she had been overwhelmed, that she had made a catastrophic decision born of desperation and an inability to find any other way out of a life that had become unbearable to her. She did not, at that point, offer a full public explanation of what the 22 days had actually looked like, the planning, the branding, the composite sketches of women who did not exist. In September 2022, a federal judge sentenced Sherri Papini to 18 months in federal prison. James Reyes was not charged with a crime. He had been, in the eyes of the law, a participant who was deceived about the full nature of what he was involved in, someone who genuinely believed he was helping a woman in distress and who did not understand the full scope of what Sherri was constructing around him. He cooperated fully with investigators once the truth began to emerge. There is a part of this story that does not get discussed enough, and it is the impact that Sherri Papini's fabricated description had on the Hispanic community in Northern California and beyond. She described 2 Hispanic women as her captors. She helped create composite sketches. Those sketches were distributed nationally, and for 22 days and for years afterward, real women, real people were viewed with suspicion, were reported to police, were treated as potential suspects because Sherri Papini needed her story to have a villain. She chose a demographic, she pointed in a direction, and she left damage behind that no courtroom sentence will ever fully address. Keith Papini rebuilt his life. He remarried. He has spoken carefully and sparingly about what the experience did to him. The public humiliation, the grief, the particular kind of devastation that comes from realizing that the person you trusted most in the world had been performing a version of you on national television while she sat in another man's apartment. He has said he focuses on his children, on moving forward, which is all anyone can really do. Sherri Papini served her sentence and was released. The Supermom blog is gone. The curated images of the perfect life, gone. The children are older now. They will grow up with a version of this story following them. And somewhere in all of it, in the planning, the branding, the 22 days, the composite sketches, the victim compensation claim, is a question that no sentence and no guilty plea has ever fully answered. What was she running from? What was so unbearable in that house, in that life, in that version of herself, that the answer was to burn her own skin and blame 2 women who didn't exist? We don't fully know, and maybe that's the most unsettling part of the whole story. Not the lie itself, but the depth of whatever was underneath it. Sherri Papini was sentenced to 18 months. Keith Papini lost years of his life to a story his wife wrote without telling him. 2 children grew up inside a family that was built on something that was never what it appeared to be. And hundreds of Hispanic women across California spent weeks being looked at with suspicion because a woman in Shasta County needed her alibi to have a face. The earbuds on the side of the road, the brand on her shoulder, the Thanksgiving morning rescue that the whole country cried over. None of it was what it looked like. It never is. True crime, dark stories, and the kind of cases that keep you up at night, all things I'm mildly obsessed with. And based on the fact that you're still here, so are you. If this case got under your skin, subscribe. We drop a new case every other day. New story, new investigation, same obsession. I'll see you in the next one.